The next cell that we have to work on is our approval count cell. If we go back over to our mockups, you'll recall that there's actually two numbers displayed in this cell. The first one is supposed to be the number of approval votes tied to an individual request, and then the second number right here is supposed to be the total number of approvers who are tied to a campaign. So this is essentially telling us the fraction of people who have already approved a given request. Now getting the first number here to show up inside the cell will be easy enough. Remember, the approvers tied to a request is stored inside of our request struct. So if I go back over to my contract file inside of my contracts directory, we had stored the number of approvers on the given request object right here as a property called approval count. So we just need to take this property off of our request object and get it to display inside that cell. Then the total number of approvers who are tied to a campaign, like the overall number of approvers, is called the approvers count variable, and that is tied to the campaign itself. So we'll need to make sure that we also eventually fetch our approvers count value as well, and somehow get that to display inside of the cell 2. Let's first take care of our approvals that is tied to an individual request, because that's definitely the easier of the two. So back inside of my request row file, I'm going to add on an additional cell. Inside of that one, I'll print out request.approvers, what do we call that thing? Approval count, gee whiz. Approval count, there we go. So now if we go back over to our browser, we should be able to verify that this number displays on the screen. At present, I would expect it to be 0 because we have not yet approved any given request. And as a matter of fact, yep, it's definitely displaying as 0 right here. So next, we need to somehow fetch our total number of approvers tied to a campaign and then get that to show up inside this cell as well. So that's going to be a piece of information that is tied to a campaign contract, not an individual request. So the request itself has no idea how many people are actually marked as approvers inside of a campaign. That is only recorded inside the campaign contract. So you might be thinking that we need to again define a getInitialProps function inside of request row right here. But instead, rather than redefining that function and importing the campaign contract again and going through all those steps, I think we could just reuse the getInitialProps function that we've already defined inside of our request index component. So here's request index. We've already got access to our campaign right here. So I think we should just make an additional call to this thing and pull off the total number of approvers. So let's take that approach. Inside of this getInitialProps function, I'm going to define another variable called approvers count. We're going to get that from await campaign.methods.approversCount.call, like so. Now we can take this new value right here and add it to our object that eventually gets added to the props of our component. So to the object, I will add approvers count. Next, I need to make sure that I communicate this approvers count from this overall component down into our request row. So I'm going to add on an additional prop to request row. I'm going to call it approvers count, and it's going to get its value from this .props.approvers count. I'm going to save this file, and then the very last thing to do is to flip on over to request row and make sure we make use of this new prop. So here's request row. I'm going to destructure approvers count off of our props object, and I'll make use of it inside our cell down here. Now inside the cell, remember, we want a / to separate those two values. I'm going to make sure that I put that / outside of my curly braces, because if I put it inside, it will be interpreted as being like a division symbol, and it'll divide those two numbers, which is definitely not what we want. So outside of the curly braces, I'll place a /, I'll put another set of curly braces, and I'll place inside there approvers count. All right, so now last thing to do is save this file and then test this out inside the browser. And it looks like I have 3 reflected here because I have contributed to my campaign from 3 separate addresses. Now you might see on here simply a 1, something to say, hey, only one person has contributed to your campaign, which is totally fine. Also, if you don't see a number reflected here, I really encourage you to simply refresh the page as well. So if you refresh, you should see a 1 or 3 or 2 or whatever it is appear on the screen too. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Now over time, as our users start to approve a given request, we should see the first number here start to increment. So I think the next thing we need to do is to define these buttons to approve and finalize a given request so we can increment this number of approvers value right here. So let's start to take care of that in the next video.